All right. Welcome to our 22nd CCF webinar of the plague year, which unfortunately didn't end on December 31st. In these very strange times, we're happy to have 3 guests with us today to talk about how the FBI preys on often vulnerable Muslims and sends them to prison for decades. We have journalist Trevor Aronson, who has written extensively about this, attorney Marwa Elbially, and Abu Horayra Hossan, whose father Mohammed was entrapped by the FBI's use of a particularly pathological informant. So we're gonna play a clip from one of Trevor's documentaries right now, and then we will talk with Trevor.
The FBI thought I was the greatest informant on the planet Earth. They told me to record everywhere.
Al Jazeera's investigative unit takes you inside the shadowy world of FBI informants and counterterrorism operations. You will meet the criminals and con men spying on orders from the FBI.
I was for them Al-Qaeda.
I am representing the Sheikh Osama bin Laden.
We will bring you the story of 3 informants posing as Muslims who encourage Americans to join plots concocted by the FBI. They are part of a post-9/11 mandate to thwart attacks before they even begin.
It literally boils down into, if you cannot find terrorists within the Muslim community, make terrorists, create the terrorist.
The FBI is not perfect in running its operations, but they're pretty damn close.
We will show how some informants are accused of violating civil liberties and why some Americans refuse to join the FBI's intelligence ranks.
I didn't want to be an informant for the FBI for the same reasons that I think that, the Muslim community should stand up to them. If I felt that they were actual terrorists running around in Toledo, I might feel differently about it.
For the first time, you will hear from a man convicted on terrorism charges who is now out of prison and back in his community.
There was never no bombs, there was never no weapons, there was never no maps, there was never no plans. It was just a bunch of hogwash.
Stay down, stay down.
All right, thank you. Trevor, we're really happy to have you with us. Trevor Aronson is a contributing writer for the Intercept and a 2020 ASU Future Security Fellow at New America. He is also executive director of the nonprofit Florida Center for Investigative Reporting and author of the book, The Terror Factory, Inside the FBI's Manufactured War on Terrorism. His 2015 TED Talk, How This FBI Strategy is Actually Creating US-Based Terrorists, has been viewed more than 1 million times and translated into more than 20 languages. Trevor also won a variety of awards, which I don't have time to tell you about. Trevor, we're really glad to have you with us today. Can you talk about the documentary that we just saw the intro from? I noticed Shahed Hussain in there, that little clip from him, and some other informants in there that I think I've seen before. Can you just talk a little bit about who was in that clip that we saw?
Yeah, hey Kathy, and thanks for having me. Yeah, it's amazing to think about. I think Kathy, you and I met maybe a little more than 10 years ago, and all of us in this room have been working on this for so very long, and probably much longer than we all anticipated at the beginning. Yeah, so I a lot of my work focuses on FBI informants, and for the last decade has done so. And a lot of people ask me, like, who I think don't appreciate the role that informants play in the FBI. They'll ask me, look, you write about the FBI a lot or cover the FBI a lot. Why do you focus so much on informants? And to me, it's this really crazy question, because it's like asking, hey, you write about the FBI a lot. Why do you write so much about agents? And the truth is that there are more informants in the FBI, working with the FBI, registered with the FBI, than there are actually special agents for the FBI. And so in that way, informants play, in many ways, a far larger role in building, or at least kind of generating the cases than even the special agents do. And that's why it's so critical that their role in the FBI is examined, even maybe more so than the role that special agents play. And so the clip from the Al Jazeera documentary Informants looked at 3 particular informants who had gotten involved in sting cases, or kind of were involved in, profiling and, spying on Muslim communities. The guy at the beginning, the bodybuilder looking guy, for example, he didn't actually provide any sting cases, but, was in this kind of involved in this landmark case in which he was basically spying on Muslim communities throughout Southern California, even though there was no indication that the FBI had that any people in those communities were committing any sort of crime at all. The only reason they had targeted those communities was simply based on their religious preference, that they were Muslim. And so, what we tried to show in this documentary is that many people doing the frontline work for the FBI in a lot of these counterterrorism stings that target Muslims are in fact informants. And all of the informants that we profiled, and indeed most of the informants you'll end up hearing about working with the FBI, are not like choir boys, right? They're not people who are like good guys who, really set out for God and country and just want to do right by everyone. I mean, in many cases, these are people who are, criminals and con men. And the way they came to the FBI is through their crimes and their cons. And so for that reason, their credibility is at first quite questionable. And at the same time, they're the ones who are, going into communities looking for would-be terrorists with an incentive to find would-be terrorists. And so as a result, they are kind of drumming up cases and really abusing the system in really problematic ways. And, obviously this doesn't just happen in Muslim communities. I mean, you see the role of informants abused in all sorts of cases against all sorts of targets of investigation. But in the post 9/11 era, in the last 2 decades, we've seen this more predominantly used against Muslim communities than perhaps any other. This idea that the FBI is enlisting criminals and con men to then go into communities and find would-be criminals or terrorists, raising real questions about whether the FBI's informant is actually a worse criminal than any of the people they end up finding.
Yeah, and the guy that you mentioned from the Southern California case, wasn't it true that one of the mosques that he was trying to infiltrate got an order of protection against him?
Yeah, so funny enough, his name is Craig Monte, the informant, and funny enough, one of the mosques, I believe it was in Tustin, but I could be wrong, it was one of the mosques in Southern California, became so concerned about his rhetoric and what he was saying about espousing violence and extremism that they actually called the FBI and were like, hey, we're really concerned about this guy, maybe you should check him out. And then of course the FBI was like, no reason to worry. And of course that caused panic inside the FBI at the time because their informant had been burned. But that same mosque, in fact, filed an order of protection and a restraining order, keeping him, asking him to stay away from the mosque, which is fascinating, right? Like this idea that the FBI is claiming to send these people out in order to keep the public safe. In fact, it's the public who's reporting the FBI's own informants as being kind of potential threats to public safety.
Yeah, and I think there was something similar to that in the Fort Dix 5 case where Sedar Tartar went to the police. He had a friend who was a policeman and tried to report this guy who wanted him to get a map of Fort Dix. And the police officer did contact the FBI and they told him, oh, don't worry about it. We know about that or something. And then Sedar got convicted anyway and is still in prison. He didn't get life like the other people in that case. It's a horrendous case. But yeah, it's happened a few times. And in some other cases, the informants were kicked out of mosques or different places. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the other people that were in that clip briefly?
Sure. Yeah. So there was the second person that you saw who was claimed to be the best informant ever was in fact this guy named Mohammed, who got involved in this case in Miami called the Liberty City 7. And you know, the Liberty City 7 was a very questionable case. I won't go at length on it, but most of the defendants are now out. And this particular informant was known to have, you know, been disqualified from service from the Chicago FBI because he had lied on a polygraph test, and then also was involved in domestic violence, a domestic violence case that the Miami PD ended up dropping out of intervention from the you know, from the FBI, which is not uncommon. You know, it's kind of amazing how often FBI informants will commit crimes, whether it's domestic abuse or financial crimes or something even violent, while on, you know, the FBI's payroll, and the FBI will often, you know, get them out of those charges because of, you know, their involvement in FBI cases. And so ultimately that informant then, you know, then moved to Texas later, and kind of the end of that story is that he ultimately was involved in this police pursuit where he was accused of being involved in some sort of operation that was running underage girls across the border from Mexico, if you can believe it. And then finally, Darren Griffin, the third informant who was involved in this case in Toledo, which was one of the earlier sting cases. He was a former US Air Force enlistee, and then ended up getting involved in a drug charge, and the drug charge flipped him into an informant. And that's how he ended up working a case that has had huge implications for not just kind of, you know, Muslims in sting cases. He engineered one of these particularly egregious sting cases, but then he also engineered this investigation of this Muslim charity, which was known as Kind Hearts. And, you know, what we saw after 9/11 was there was a host of Muslim charities that were really aggressively targeted by the FBI under claims that they were somehow supporting terrorism, although the evidence of that really never was shown. And Kind Hearts was one of those examples. And so, you know, in addition to, you know, the problematic cases where FBI informants have, you know, manipulated young and impressionable men to get involved in plots that they could never on their own, at the end FBI ends up engineering, there also was this real chilling effect on Muslim charities as a result of the prosecutions of organizations like Kind Hearts. And anyway, so yeah, so, you know, and when I say that, you know, these informants that we talk about, it's important to remember too, you know, we're really, you know, whenever you're talking about informants in the public and in the public record, you know, you're really kind of describing the tip of an iceberg, because the informants that we know about are really the few that for various circumstances have come to the public attention. But then below the waterline, obviously, you have this huge number of informants that we don't know a lot about. And many of these informants could be committing acts of crime or behavior that is even more egregious than the ones that we do know about. But from the ones that we do know about, you know, there is a clear pattern of criminal behavior and abuse that the FBI over and over again, you know, ends up kind of excusing under this claim that it's for the greater good, whether it's national security or some other criminal investigation.
Yeah, that's a great point, that it's the tip of the iceberg, because we don't know about the cases where nobody got charged. And a lot of times when people do get charged, we don't know who the informant is because the case pleads out based on the threats of a really severe sentence. I just want to mention a couple of things, segueing from what you were saying about the charity cases. I know there's a lot of charity cases, the Holy Land case, and there was another charity case with, I think, IARA charity. And one of the people that was caught up in that case was a congressman named Mark Siljander, and he just got pardoned by Trump because he knew some influential people. That's the only way you get pardoned by Trump. He's the only person in our database, as far as I know, who got pardoned by Trump. And as far as the Liberty 7 case, I think that was kind of the number one example for an excellent movie that came out recently by filmmaker Chris Morris in England called The Day Shall Come. So if anybody wants to try to find that and see that, I totally recommend that. And there's some other good movies too that have to do with sting cases. But Trevor, I know you recently wrote an article in the Intercept about a Florida case of an informant who was actually caught committing crimes on the tape that he was being recorded by with the FBI. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So this was a man named Mohammed Elbially, and he came to the FBI's attention around 2010 because at the time Elbially was an Israeli citizen who was living in Canada, and he was a scam artist. He he would end up looking up wealthy Muslims from around the world and then call them in this supposed stranded traveler scheme where he would say, hey, I'm coming to your town and, whatever unforeseen circumstances came up and I need money to get there. And, preying on the generosity of those Muslims, he would then get money through Western Union and would do this over and over and over again, and ended up doing it to this mosque in Mobile, Alabama. They pursued charges through the Justice Department. He was extradited and prosecuted, and then was recruited to become an FBI informant, where he then was moved to Florida. And what's interesting about it is that we know through court records that he wasn't able to hold down employment. It was the FBI that was kind of keeping him from deportation. And we also know from court records that over the course of 10 years, he'd only received on average about $20,000 total. And yet he was living in this really nice house with a pool and 2 really nice cars. And what ended up happening was after he ran a sting involving three Black converts to Islam, who he kind of wrapped up in this plot to support ISIS by traveling to Syria. Of course, no one was in contact with anyone of ISIS, and no one, in fact, made it outside the United States. But the plot, was constructed enough that they charged these men with material support. And one of these men's defense lawyers noticed that as a result of the FBI installing a camera in Muhammad's house in order to record meetings with the targets of the sting operation, he was kind of inadvertently caught running his stranded traveler scheme on the recording. And so this defense lawyer then takes it to the Justice Department and says, hey, you got to check this out. At that point, the FBI really couldn't cover anything up, and they had to pursue charges against Mohammed Elbially, who was then convicted. I think he spent 2 years in prison and then was promptly deported to Israel. So as a result of his feeling very betrayed, he then talked to me about like this whole idea. And what he had described was that, for 10 years, the FBI knew that he was preying on other Muslims. He was running these scams, and he was, getting money in, and that they were okay with that, and they protected him as long as he continued to work with them as an informant. And what's fascinating about this, obviously, is they knew of apparently and allowed this kind of decade-long fraud. But the other thing that's really critical, and this is something that one of the men caught up in the sting operation, his lawyer had noted in a filing, is that it also helps protect the FBI by the FBI allowing this person to like run scams worth tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars over a decade. They're able to pay that informant a lot less. And so if a case ever goes to trial, they can say like, oh, look, we've only paid this guy $20,000 on average a year. It's not like, we are, buying his testimony lock, stock, and barrel. And so the important thing to keep in mind is that when an informant's credibility is put into question by defense lawyers, oftentimes the amount of money that they receive from the FBI is a big factor. Obviously, this idea that like, you'll say whatever you want in order to get this paycheck. And so what was interesting about Mohammed Elbially's case is that, at least according to the defense lawyers who litigated it, was this idea that, part of the FBI's incentive was to, allow him to work as an informant. But the other part of it potentially was to limit the liability of his, credibility if he were ever called to testify. And so I think what's interesting about this, and the larger point I tried to get at in my article, is that there really isn't a whole lot of accountability for the FBI informants when they commit crimes, whether those crimes are authorized or not. Under policy, the FBI is supposed to inform the Justice Department of the number of crimes that were authorized, but also the number of crimes that were unauthorized, and that like crimes that the FBI was not aware were going to occur. But beyond that, there's very little transparency. These numbers do not go to Congress. These are not the type of numbers that come up in congressional hearings. In fact, of the documents that we know of, I mean, in a short, I think it was a 4 or 5 year period, the FBI admitted in Justice Department filings that its informants had committed 20,000 crimes, right? So it's not like a small number of crimes that they are committing. Granted, some of these are small, probably not really worth registering, but others are quite significant, whether that's violent crimes or or things that Mohammed Al-Ghurayah had done by, ripping off Muslims around the world for tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so again, it kind of raises this question of, in the service of informants who are supposed to be, stopping crime, how many other crimes is the FBI allowing? And at present, we don't really have a good, clear view of that. And that's really part of the problem. I mean, I think, this is probably the topic for a whole other discussion, but there really is kind of a larger accountability issue in the FBI, in that, like, where, there is supposed to be a large amount of accountability through Congress, we're just not seeing that because there just isn't the political will to be, tough on the FBI in a way that I think there should be.
That's right. And that's a great point about it actually being the FBI has reason to allow these crimes or cover up for these crimes because they benefit from it if the person can make money that way, and then they can say they're not paying them that much. And this guy was just dumb enough to get caught on their tape, and so how many times does this happen? It's probably quite common. So we'll come back to you, I think, but right now I'd like to turn to Marwa Elbially. Marwa is an attorney committed to advocating for the rights of underrepresented groups. Prior to opening her practice, Ms. Elbially worked for several years at nonprofits on a wide variety of legal issues that affected the civil liberties of Muslims in the United States, involving criminal, civil, and immigration law. Marwa, it's great to have you. We've worked together on and off for years, as I have with everybody else on here. It's wonderful to see you. I know you've been involved to one extent or another with several cases that dealt with informants. I'd like you to start by talking about one in particular where you managed to identify the informant. As Trevor pointed out, a lot of times we don't know who the informants are, even when people get charged. And in this case, you probably wouldn't have known, except you were able to find out. And can you talk about that a bit?
Hi, Kathy. And first of all, I want to thank Trevor for all his great investigative reporting on this subject. I've learned quite a bit from reading his articles over the years and his book. So I do appreciate his work and his continued commitment to exposing this, basically the crimes and the use of informants, particularly against the Muslim community. That specific case, what happened is we were able to discover it was actually an undercover detective, and we were able to identify her because there was an article released that cited certain facts, and then we were able actually to identify her through Google searches. It took some time and some persistence, and we went through quite a few pages. We didn't get it from the first page, but then we were able to retrieve pictures and from a wedding that she had attended and show it to our client in that case, and she was able to confirm which of the attendees was the informant. Our undercover detective in that case. And from there, we got permission from the judge to disclose it. That case ended up in a plea agreement, so that never actually went to trial. But yeah, that was an unusual case, and especially given the prevalence of social media. And that case involved younger defendants and a younger informant. There's a surprising amount of information available online these days.
There is, and that was great work for you. I didn't realize she was actually working as an undercover detective in that case. Wow, good work. And it may have helped get a better plea deal in the case. Are there any other cases you'd like to mention that you were involved with, or that you know about that involved informants that you want to mention right now?
I mean, there's so many cases, unfortunately, that involve informants. And Trevor was mentioning the tip of the iceberg. Like, for example, the informants that were just discussed, those are paid informants, like for criminals, people with issues specifically that they want favors in exchange from the government. Informants don't just include those individuals, right, who are actually on the government payroll, however small. You also, unfortunately, have a lot of community members who don't consider themselves informants, who meet with the FBI and are, maybe not on a regular basis, once a year or whatever, and they're giving them information and they consider it just, an exchange. That is informing, right? You might think that the information that you're giving is just innocent. Oh, well, I noticed that guy wasn't attending the mosque as much, that whatever. All that stuff is noted in files for that individual. That is you're considered an informant in those kind of cases, even though you might not even consider yourself such. I'm particularly interested in Romania. Under Ceausescu, there was a lot of informants. He built like an incredible structure. They estimate like hundreds of thousands of informants. And recently, not recently, I guess it's been like over a decade now, they created a commission for declassifying security files. And it's really interesting, the information that's come out from the declassification, right? And just the amount of average individuals who were involved in informing on their friends and neighbors for whatever reason, for various reasons. One of them was like, he wanted to get a visa to see his daughter out of the country. One of them was like a variety of reasons why they were involved within the system. So I thought that was interesting and something to watch, even though we don't consider ourselves like that. But I think it's we shouldn't underestimate like the system that's out there and the number of people involved.
Yeah, that's a good point about the word informant. It really refers to a lot of different levels of working for the FBI, because you can just be somebody who's giving them information, somebody who meets with them, as you said. That's quite different. I mean, that's being an informant, but that's different than the people who we really should probably call provocateurs, who are the ones that wear wires and try to actually create cases, create terrorists. So we need to be aware of both of those levels and various levels in between. And of course, the FBI has a variety of ways to get people to be informants. And one of those that was something that happened recently with the Supreme Court case was they were putting people on the no-fly list. And then if they would agree to be an informant, they would take them off the no-fly list. And there was the Supreme Court case was Tanvir v. Tanzine, I think, where Ramzi Qasem and CCR won the ability to seek damages against the FBI for doing this. So now they have to go back and fight that case through the court and try to get the damages and prove the case. But they were allowed to do that. Then that went all the way to the Supreme Court because of a bad ruling below. But anyway, it was a great decision. It was unanimous, amazingly. So hopefully the FBI won't be doing that as much. I don't know, but they got a lot of other ways that they use. Marwa, I know you do some work around educating people on their rights and kind of how to react if you're approached by the FBI or somebody that you think might be an informant. Do you want to talk about that a bit?
I don't know how often the FBI just poses it to you like, hey, you want to become an informant? It's I don't think it's usually put out like that.
No, I'm talking about
no. I'm just saying, like, in terms of educating people, like people might think that, oh, they just come up to you and be like, hey, if you got information on the community, you want to be an informant. Maybe they do in some cases, but in most cases, they're looking for leverage on you first. Right. I've seen it a lot in. Trevor mentioned some of those criminal cases where people have pending criminal charges. Also, another common point of leverage is immigration. People often have immigration issues for whatever reason. They might come even paroled into the country for the purposes of being informants, or they might have some issue that puts them in removal proceedings, and then the FBI, while they can't technically tell you that we're going to give you any immigration benefit, it's kind of implied that they're going to help them out. Their file might stop moving. They had a background check that's been pending forever, and maybe they get that moving. In most of the immigration cases I've seen, the FBI doesn't actually help the person out because then they lose their leverage on them, right? So they drag it out for them. So I think, so what are you looking for in terms of just know your rights generally?
Well, so if somebody, say, for whatever reason, say you're an immigrant, or maybe you're not an immigrant, say just if somebody comes from the FBI and wants to talk to you, what should you do?
Never talk with the FBI, period. Unless you have an attorney present, period. Like, there's no reason for you ever to have any kind of discussion with a law enforcement agent without your attorney present. It's never, ever in your interest. Say if you were at your home and you get a knock on the door, Number one, you don't have to open that door. You have a right not to open the door. If you decide to, if for whatever reason you didn't know, obviously you probably won't know who's at the door. You open the door, and the individual identifies themselves as a law enforcement officer. Don't invite them in your house. Go ahead and request a copy of their information, a card, and let them know that your attorney will reach out to them. And there is plenty of services available within the community and without. Like you could contact CARE, CCR, the National Lawyers Guild. I think
For
also
us too,
CCF,
CCF.
obviously. Yeah, sorry, the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. And make sure you get an attorney. Even if you don't have an attorney that you're in contact with at the time, tell them that you're going to have an attorney who's going to reach out to them. Don't speak with them. I think a tactic that's often used by law enforcement is they're just really nice. And a lot of us don't want to be rude or disrespectful to somebody who's at the door of our house or wherever and who's being very polite to us. You can be polite back. It just like, I might be interested in talking with you, but I'll only do so with an attorney present. And you can change your mind later on and just not talk with them. Like you're under no obligation to speak with them at any time. Ever.
That's right. Thank you.
Yeah.
And do you represent people who are approached by the FBI? I know I do.
Yes.
And so they could contact you maybe.
They can contact me as well, yeah.
So very often what happens is if somebody contacts me, I will then reach out to the FBI, say I represent them and that I advise them not to speak to them. And I'm telling the agent, don't speak to them without letting me know, and we'll see whether we want to or not. And almost always that's the end of it. They're just on a fishing expedition. Occasionally they'll tell me what they want to know about, and in those cases I still end up saying, all right, well, we're not gonna, if you have questions you want to submit in writing, which they tend not to do, it's almost never that the person ends up talking to them. I think that only happened once with me, and that was when they gave us a grand jury subpoena. So there was another time recently when they really, really wanted to talk to the person because her boyfriend was being charged with terrorism in Australia, and we didn't let them. They kept trying and trying, and I kept saying no, and they finally gave up. And then the charges actually got dismissed against the guy in Australia, which never happens here hardly. But anyway, so don't talk to them. Don't let them in your house. They'll look around. They'll look for anything that you think might be totally innocent, what books you have. They're going to try to use it against you in whatever twisted way they can. So don't let them in. Don't talk to them. Just say your attorney will contact them, even if you don't have an attorney at the time. Contact CARE or us or, all these for Marwa. And most likely that'll be the end of it. So, all right. Thanks, Marwa. I'd like to, I don't know if you want to say anything quickly before I turn to Abu Horayra. And then
Yeah, just a little follow-up on the thing, because I know a lot of people in our community have contact with FBI and nothing's happened to them. No criminal charges. They didn't have any immigration issues and that sort of thing. So what I wanted, like everything that you're saying to them is going into a file, even if it's those community meetings. I know I forgot what the term they use exactly for them, but it's like those community outreach meetings that they've had a lot often with the Muslim community. All of that information is going into the record. And while you aren't, I don't think most people who are meeting with them are necessarily taking notes and recalling everything. That information can be used against you and others at any time, even years from now. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And the other thing I like to mention is the FBI is not approaching people from other communities on a regular basis like it's approaching the Muslim community, right? It's not like it's common for the Baptist church to have a meeting with the FBI for their board of trustees or with their religious leader once a year, twice a year, or every month or whatever. It just doesn't happen. So you got to question, why have we allowed ourselves to become second-class citizens and to maintain a relationship like this with the law enforcement agency? For no reason, honestly. Like if there is an issue, yes, you can contact them, again through an attorney, but there's no reason for Muslim community or any members or Muslims in general to be meeting with the FBI without an attorney or on a regular basis for any reason.
Exactly. It's horrendous that Muslims have to worry about that in their mosque. That, when they go in to pray, they have to worry about, is the FBI there? It's horrible. All right. I'd like to turn to Abu Horayra Hossan. Horayra is a friend of mine, and he lives here in Albany, where I live. He's the son of Mohammed Hossain, who was recently released from prison after serving a 15-year sentence. He and his co-defendant, Yassin Arif, were completely innocent, but were set up by the FBI using the informant Shahed Hussain. Mohammed was kind of the collateral damage of the case because the FBI was actually trying to get to Yassin. And yet Mohammed never would have been charged with anything if it wasn't for that. Shahed Hussain lied to everybody in the case, of course, the targets and everybody else, including the FBI that he was dealing with. He would tell the FBI that Mohammed was saying things like, I want to bomb Americans, when actually when the tapes came out and got translated from Urdu, he would say, I'm a good American citizen and I love America and things like that. So Shahed Hussain is basically a pathological liar. And after the case with Horayra's dad, we thought they weren't going to use him anymore, but they sent him down to Newburgh and they used him in the Newburgh case, which if we have time, I'll talk about that. And then they even there, I thought really they're not going to use him again because he could have gotten charged for perjury coming out of that case. But they kept using him and they sent him to Pittsburgh, where he was actually part of an undercover documentary. And if we have time, we'll talk about that. But then he got involved in a limo business in Schoharie County. Well, the limo business ended up causing, his limo ended up being involved in a horrendous crash a couple years ago in Schoharie County that killed 20 people, and it's very infamous. And he ran away to Pakistan right before that and will not come back and face charges. His son is facing charges in the case, even though he was running the company. Anyway, so he's not a good guy. Horayra, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, good to see you. Horayra is a great guy. Can you talk about, if you remember when you first met Shahed Hussain back when you were a kid? I don't know what you remember about that, or what you know about his interactions with your dad and your siblings way back in 2003, 2004.
I was fairly young. I was born in '96, so I probably was around 6 or 7 years old at the time, when he first started initially coming around. From, my memory as a child, I remember he used to bring this Freihofer's truck. It's like baked goods and donuts and, all sorts of, goodies and stuff. And he used to come and he'd give us little toys and, just, basically give you things. And as kids, we were kind of naive, and my dad was strict with us. He was trying to raise us upright and, to have the American dream just like he had. And he was so passionate about it. And he was just so clear and transparent with everything that he did. So, this guy would come to my dad's store day in and day out and just kind of, linger around and stuff like that. And my dad would be in the middle of working still and, serving pizzas to customers and, doing deliveries and stuff. And he would still sit down and, be talking with him in the meantime. And he'd just give us little toys and stuff and, like cheaply made from what I can remember. And he'd just do it over and over, for like weeks and months. That's how I remember him when I was a kid. I don't remember much, from the private meetings because I never attended. I was too young for that. My older brother, went to a few of those, but that's as much of as I remember when I was a kid.
Yeah, I think he had some store where he would like import a bunch of stuff, like cheap stuff from China. So he probably got a lot of those toys as part of that, maybe. But was there something about a remote control helicopter or something that they came back and they wanted back later because it might have had a recording device? Do you remember anything about that? I just heard about that a little bit, but
I'm not 100% certain about it. But the toys that he would give us, if I were to give you a detail, it's these it's like a little a handle where you kind of yank the string and the helicopter just propels up. It's like sitting on top of this little joystick kind of thing, and you kind of give it a yank, and then it goes. And a lot of those toys back in that time was like Beyblades and a lot of pull and rotate sort of toys. So that's basically the toy that he gave. I'm not sure about retrieving any of them, but most of them, because they were poorly made, we like played with them until they broke. So
yeah.
That's pretty much what happened with that.
Okay. So I know a few years ago, you had another encounter with Shahed Hussain, which we talked about at the time. And do you want to talk about that? What happened with that?
Sure. Well, firstly, I'd like to say, more recently, like after even this experience that I'm getting ready to share, this guy, he's just, you know, he's somebody who claims certain things, and he's not a person of moral code at all. He has no backbone or anything, you know. He claims to be Muslim. He claims so many things. And I read an article in Times Union that like kind of highlighted his entire story of, you know, of what he did and all his wrongdoings and stuff. And before he was an informant, he lived a checkered life. Like, it was not, you know, it was not on the straight and narrow. It's completely like, you know, sleazy and, you know, trying to cut corners, and, you know, nothing was ever on paper. Nothing was really ever, you know, it was just all kind of in the air. And, you know, and even with his family and stuff like that, everything just kind of like, you know, broke apart. And my experience with him, like probably in 2015 or 16, I was working in Saratoga, and I needed a, you know, an inn to stay at, or like, you know, somewhere to rent for like the month while I was working out there. And, you know, we got referred to by a customer that we were dropping off there. You know, it's a courier service, a chauffeur service, taxiing. And basically, when we dropped them off, they're like, yeah, we stay here. You know, it's pretty, you know, reasonable. And, you know, it's just not too far away from Saratoga, like the actual city. And we were like, cool, let's get into it. And he had some guy, you know, kind of like, you know, doing all the front work for him and getting people, you know, situated with their place. And when we went there, it was just disgusting, and we had to clean it up. We had to buy cleaning supplies. We had to, you know, like, it was disgusting, like full on, you know, with the meaning of the word. Like, it was, the floors were dirty, bathroom was dirty. You know, it just wasn't maintained at all. And then, you know, we found out with an uneasy feeling, we found out that he actually owned that, you know, that the inn. And he was running his limo business out of the back of it. I remember seeing many limos parked in the back of it. And at one point, I even dropped his sons off in my cab to the suites, because his house was right next door to the suites. And you know, they seemed like, you know, same type of behavior, you know, really shady, you know, really like, you know, trying to flaunt like money and trying to flaunt, you know, they were with women. They were just doing a whole lot of, you know, partying and stuff like that, from what was apparent to me. But informants, like, in general, they try to play the role of somebody who you think would be somebody who's upright or something, but they are completely, you know, completely on the left field. Because he came and he's told my dad that basically, I need to learn more about the religion. I feel like I've been falling off. And, you know, that's typically what happens to people. You know, you're up on, you know, in the straight and narrow, and you know, some life happens and you kind of fall off, and you're trying to find your bearings and get back on the straight and narrow. And he's basically telling my dad that story. And my dad didn't have anything else to believe, you know, anything else to think about him besides whatever he told him, face value. And, you know, little by little, he just started, you know, coming more and more and more. And then he started being strange about it. You know, he'd show up at random times and, you know, not let my dad know that he's coming, and, you know, all sorts of things, which my dad kind of shared, you know, in a documentary that he got interviewed for. So, you know, I'm learning more and more about it as I grow older, but meeting him in that encounter, I seen that, you know, not only is he living close to where he home wrecked, he's living comfortably, like right, you know, not even, you know, 50 miles from us. So, I mean, it's upsetting, to say the least. And I don't think people like that who commit crimes should be given another opportunity to commit crime. Like, you're not going to take somebody who just committed a crime and say, hey, I could let you off this criminal charge if you go be an informant for us, because that doesn't take away their criminal characteristics. So, you know, taking a guy who's been, you know, committing fraud and crime his whole life and turning him into an informant, he's not going to be a good informant. Neither is he going to, you know, and he just left a trail of you know, hurt behind him. And I know this is a touchy subject, but the Skahari crash, it was one of the biggest automobile accidents in upstate in the United States history, from what I heard. And also there's also a story of Pakistani officials and law enforcement going after him because he's wanted for 2 murders in Pakistan. So I mean, I won't be shy to talk about it because that's what he did, and that's the type of person that the FBI is hiring and putting on payroll to come into a community and basically ruin people who are trying to be trying to stand upright and take care of their family. And that's basically my experience with him, and it wasn't a good one at all.
Yes, thanks. And didn't you confront him at one point when you were up there? And
I did.
And he lied about it.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I could share the encounter. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine.
No, when you're 7 and 8 years old and your dad gets taken away, and you get a chance to see the person who basically is responsible for falsifying information or mistranslating things that he said just to put him away for 15 years. I mean, I don't know what was going through my mind at the time, but I was furious. But one thing about me is that I didn't want to confront it because I didn't want any issues at all. However, I did say, you know what, let's confront him, let's get a video, and we'll see what happens from there. One day we saw him sitting down. We were getting ready to come to Albany, and we saw him sitting down. I was working with a good family friend of mine named Jazeera, and he came with me. He was helping me out. He's like, hey, I think that's the guy. I think that's the guy who who's the informant in your dad's case. And I was like, really, you think so? And then I it's been so long that I may have forgotten his face, but when I saw him, instantly I remembered from my memory that is indeed the guy. He's sitting there very carefree, and me and brother Jazeera, we're just speaking amongst each other, like, what are we going to say? What are we going to confront him with? So I quickly put my my little phone, I start recording over there, and I kind of hang the phone on the side of my body, and I'm just walking with it in my hand just so I could get a proper angle and kind of move it casually and and try to get a good video. Of course, the video came out choppy, but as soon as we went to him in the video, you could see him glance right at the camera. So he already knows how these things go. And we confronted him, and we said, we know who you are, and you're not discreet, you're not anything, you're not low for what you did, like you're not being able to disguise yourself and hide yourself. We know who you are, we know what you did. And he said, what are you talking about? I'm good, and I am. Brother Jazeera confronted him and said, are you Muslim? He's like, yeah, I am, and he said a word in Arabic. This is mashallah, means sorry, the words coming out of my mind, like mashallah means like, of course I am, it's like a gracious thing that, yeah, I am, I'm really glad about it, and alhamdulillah, like, thank God I am Muslim, and he says to him, he said, you should be ashamed of yourself, because that's not a Muslim, you're not somebody who's a Muslim, no, you're a hypocrite, and you did this and this. And he said, no, I did not. He's just blatantly lying. And then we're like, okay, so where were you in August 2004? He said, oh, I was in Tennessee. He just said so many different lies and stuff. And as we were leaving there, we tried to get our refund for that week because we'd already paid up front. And he tells us, he was like, no, we're not going to get it back. We called the police there in Saratoga. We basically told them that, this and this was happening, and that they're not issuing a refund to us. And immediately he called the FBI agent, who basically hired him and helped him out. And we got threatening calls from his sons. I wish I had saved the voicemails. He basically threatened to kill me, threatened to put a body bag with my name on it, threatened to, slam me on my neck, is what he said in the audio, in the voicemail. And of course, I wasn't trying to answer any of the calls and stuff. I'm not over here trying to engage them, and basically I was, I was receiving all these calls. And then the next morning, I get a voicemail or a missed call from an FBI agent. And that's when I reached out to you, Kathy. And thank you so much. You've really been a pillar for me. And I always bother you a lot for some of these things, but I appreciate you again.
Well,
that's what happened.
You're wonderful. And I did not realize, or maybe I forgot, it's been a while, that his sons actually threatened you like that, and threatened your life.
Yeah.
Wow. But I remember seeing the video. You actually did a good job recording it. It was a good video, and it showed him really clearly, and it showed him lying about who he was, saying that wasn't him. And then, of course, when you told me the FBI agent had called you, I called the FBI agent, as I've had to do a few times over the years, this particular guy, and Tim Cole. And I said, look, you know, I have a video of this encounter. He was not, because Shahed Hussain told the agent that you were threatening him, and I had the video, and he weren't. And I said, look, I have this video. He clearly wasn't threatening him. He just confronted him and said, you know, how do you feel about what you did? Like, you did this to my family. You did this to my dad. Like, how can you deal with that? And he denied that was him. And there was no way you were threatening. Neither you nor Jabber was at all threatening to him at all. And Tim Cole said, all right, yeah, okay. And that was the end of it. But that is the kind of guy Shahed Hussain is. He can't seem to stop himself from lying and committing all sorts of fraud and crimes. Like, I don't know if he's a sociopath or what he is, but that's what he does. The reason he became an informant in the first place is because he was committing fraud at the Department of Motor Vehicles, and he got caught, and he was going to go to prison and then be deported to Pakistan, where at that time he was facing a murder charge. That appears to have been resolved now. But anyway, then he became an informant. He started doing some cases for the FBI, and then he got involved in your dad's case, unfortunately.
You know, what's sad is what happened to you know, the Muhyiddin family, Imam Yassin and my dad. But more so, there are families of those 20 lost you know, souls that you know, that they don't have an answer because they just, you know, basically used a service that they thought was going to be a, you know, a good night, a really good night, and they trusted their life to this limousine company, which was owned by him. So, you know, my heart goes out to their families, and you know, I haven't met them yet. I don't want it to be, you know, a bad taste. I've wanted to go there and, you know, share my condolences, but I mean, you know, for that to have happened, you know, I mean, in my mind, it's on the FBI's shoulders, because they allowed him to be out. They allowed him. He could have been behind bars and none of this would have happened, but they allowed him to be on the streets. They allowed him to go back in and basically destroy other people's lives, and literally, because you know, they're gone. They don't live. You know, those are daughters, those are sons, those are brothers, those are fathers of, you know, some family members, and they're not here anymore. And that's all his fault. And you know, we should definitely hold him accountable for it. We shouldn't let him off the hook, like, you know, like the FBI has been doing before. And you know, we should really, you know, kind of be aware of what's going on, because you know, you've got to be clear and transparent with what you believe and everything. However, you know, there are people who are around that don't want your best interest. So it's not always, you have to kind of move with a grain of salt and kind of, you know, basically walk on eggshells when you're you know, introducing yourself to people or speaking to people. And if you don't necessarily know them, you don't feel shy about not speaking to them at all. Be like, I'm sorry, you know, you make me uncomfortable and I don't want to speak to you at all, you know. And that's what I'll say to a lot of young guys who, you know, who necessarily haven't been engaged or encountered any of this. They should probably stay away from it completely, just because, you know, you don't know what the other person has in their mind or what agenda they have behind you know, their eyes. So, you know.
Yeah, thank you. And Shahed Hussain, I mean, I think the FBI really enabled him to do what he did with this limo company, because he has this whole history of committing minor fraud crimes, and it didn't, as far as I know, result in anybody's death, although who knows what happened in Pakistan where there was that murder. But he, you know, his motel, like you said, it was never up to code. He was always trying to get around any kind of regulations for safety and health. There was like raw sewage all over the place there. He was in the paper a bunch of times for things like that. He had a string of civil suits against him. Some of that we knew about at the time of your dad's case, and there was a lot more since then. And there were other things that I read about in the Times Union when they investigated him, stuff I never even heard of, because he did it all the time. That's all he did, is he committed these crimes. But with the limo company, he didn't even care that his car didn't have working brakes. I mean, they pretended to fix them. They lied about fixing them. And he was temporarily in Pakistan, and his son was running the company in his absence, but he was getting all the, you know, he was calling up his dad and saying, how do I handle this, and the other thing? At least that's what he's saying. Then the limo crash happened, and the son ended up being charged. and his dad is just like staying in Pakistan now. He's not going to come back and help his son. He's not going to come back and possibly face charges here. He's not even going to come back for his own son. So that's the kind of guy he is. And now we don't have to worry about seeing him around here anymore, but people in Pakistan have to worry about whatever he's doing there. And he's continuing to do stuff there, involved with real estate, and his rich brother-in-law there, whoever he is, Malik. Excuse me. So I guess I'd like to turn back to Trevor and see if he has anything to add about all the stuff we're talking about. And I'm going to see if there's any questions. And because I can't see Facebook, so if there's any questions on Facebook, maybe somebody could put them in the chat here on the Zoom. We do have, let's see. So Amberine Al-Qadar, who's a filmmaker, says about the limo crash, my heart goes out to the affected families. And thanks for recalling this, difficult as it may be. Or maybe she means all the families, not just the limo crash families, but the families of the targets that he went after in the cases, like your dad and Brother Yassin. Let's see. Oh, it looks like we have some questions here. Oh, this is, can you please inform the listeners of the informant detective's name? That would be Marwa. I don't know. Marwa, are you still here? Is that something you can inform us about or not?
I don't recall it.
Oh, you don't recall it? Okay.
All
right. All right. Let's see, what else do we have here? Oh, Farouk Chandawawa says, is there a book or an article detailing FBI use of informants? Well, certainly Trevor can talk about that. He wrote a book about it, and maybe you could mention that, Trevor, and anything else you want to add about what we've just been talking about.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so at the risk of self-promotion, I did do a book. I wrote a book in 2013 called The Terror Factory, and we updated it, I believe, in 2015. So it covers the first 10 to 15 years, depending on the edition you get, of the post 9/11 era. And what it focuses on is the use of informants, the FBI policies that drive stings, and focuses on a number of specific cases, including Mohammed Hossain's case and the story of Shahed Hussain in one chapter. Obviously, like any book, it gets dated fairly quickly. So I would point you to a project that my colleague Margot Williams and I work on at the Intercept called Trial and Terror. And in that, we update prosecutions of terrorism cases as they come through the courts. And you can filter the cases as you need, like according to state or sting or informant. So for example, if you go to the Intercept, just search the Intercept Trial and Terror. One of the filters you can use is to filter the cases by sting and informant, and that'll bring together all cases since 9/11 that court records show involved a sting and an informant, and that way you can kind of look at the details. We write a short description of every case and look at the details of the more recent cases we've had. And what's incredible is that I think we're up over more than 800 people in our data collection of people who've been charged with terrorism cases post 9/11. In the last 7 to 8 years, it's been almost exclusively sting and material support cases. And so I say that to say, this is not kind of an anomalous thing that happened 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. It's something that happens every month, and every year we're having dozens and dozens more of these types of cases. We're also seeing these types of tactics used in other areas, including more recently right-wing domestic threats. And I guess one of the things I would put out there is that there is now this concern, I think, among people who look at these cases that as abusive and as egregious as these tactics were against Muslims, it's possible we'll start to see them in other targeted communities, and that may include, right-wing actors or people who, espouse really terrible beliefs on the right wing, but lack the capacity for terrorism on their own. And I think it's really important to keep track of those cases as well, because it's not really just the targeted community, it's also the use of these very abusive tactics, no matter who the target is.
That's a really good point. And we actually have been following some of those right-wing cases. There's one family we're involved with where their family member and other people got entrapped in one of those cases, actually targeting Somalis. But it was one of those cases where they got manipulated by the FBI, and they wouldn't have been doing anything otherwise. They didn't know each other otherwise. And they got really long sentences. Usually the right-wing people don't, but these guys did. And then there's a more recent case where some Boogaloo boys were targeted by an informant who actually pretended to be from Hamas and saying, oh, we want to work with you, which is completely ridiculous. They have nothing in common. They would never work together. But they did that so that they could get material support charges, because Hamas is listed by the State Department as a designated terrorist organization. And so without that, it's not so easy to get material support to terrorism charges. And so that they used Hamas that way. And so it makes Hamas look bad, except it's not really Hamas. It makes these guys look bad, and it creates a case for them. So that's what they do. And let's see, we have a comment in the chat here from Huma Yassin saying Mahmoud Omar in the Fort Dix 5 case threatened to murder and burn people's houses down, and the FBI was well aware of his ongoing crimes, and that he was saying that while he was wearing a wire, which I wasn't aware of, even though I have been involved in the Fort Dix 5 case. There's so much to that case. I know we did a webinar on it, but there's so much to that case that I didn't even know. Do you know anything about that, Trevor, about Mahmoud Omar in that case?
Yeah, I mean, I know of the Fort Dix. I wasn't, if I at some point was aware of the threat of burning down a house, I have since forgotten it, but it wouldn't surprise me at all. Like the Fort Dix 5 case was also hugely problematic. The sentences that those defendants received was also incredible, right? I think a couple of them, if not a few of them, were sentenced to life in prison.
Four of them were sentenced to life in prison.
Yeah. So I mean, it's incredible how stiff the sentences were. Yeah, no, the Fort Dix 5 was definitely one of the more egregious cases. I mean, one of the things that you see, this is kind of historical fact that not everyone probably find interesting, but I think one of the interesting things is in those early cases, the FBI tended to be kind of sloppy in how it put together the stings. It kind of always created a kind of more nebulous plot, and the Fort Dix 5 case was a bit like that. Later, they refined their tactics where they would get people to their playbook would basically get someone to have like a fake bomb, and then a cell phone would be the trigger, and they dial it in order to show the act. And so, I think the FBI learned that they have to kind of walk people up to that line in order to make prosecutions a little easier. I mean, that's a weird thing to say, given that, these Fort Dix 5 guys ended up getting life. But, what you saw was that there's early cases like Mohammed Hossain's and the Toledo case and the Fort Dix 5 case, there was kind of a more nebulous conspiracy that then I think the FBI learned that they needed to have something, kind of more specific plot. The other thing I remember, if you don't mind my taking just a moment, Marwa mentioned something that I think is really important, and I'm glad she did, which is this idea that, I had mentioned there are 15,000 registered informants, and it's absolutely true that that isn't the entirety of the FBI's informant network. A lot of times the FBI has what agents call hip pocket informants, which are people that don't necessarily get registered. They don't have an informant number, but they are people whose information will get put in files or spark investigations in some way. The number that I've heard agents peg that at is for every informant that they have registered, there's about 3 that they don't have registered, or so-called hip pockets. So that puts the number at around 45,000 plus the 15. So you're looking at an entire kind of network of 60,000 informants. And then the other thing to keep in mind that Mara also mentioned is this idea that anything informants tell the FBI in turn can be put in a file. and a file under your name, and there really isn't any sort of like fact-checking process to make sure that true information gets put in your file. And so in fact, I was looking at this case that is not a terrorism case, but it was an FBI case, and the defendant's file had information from 15 years earlier where they interviewed his ex-wife, and the ex-wife allegedly claimed that he was into child pornography and credit card fraud and a number of other terrible crimes. And I called the ex-wife and I was like, do you remember talking to the FBI? And she's like, yeah, and here's what I told them. And I explained like what the FBI file said, she said, and she was like, I didn't say that at all. I don't know where that comes from. It's possible she was lying to me, but I don't think so. And so I guess what I say is like, what's, the insidiousness of the informant network is that's oftentimes really misinformation or just deliberately false information can be put in your file. And that means that an agent, say 5, 6, 7 years from now, who wasn't attached to the original gathering of the information, gets that information, and that really colors their view of who this person is, and that could color their investigation. So just as an example, if an informant says, so-and-so loves to watch ISIS propaganda or Al-Qaeda propaganda, that gets put in your file, 5, 6 years later, someone takes a look at you, and even if that's not true, that's what's kind of coloring their perception of who you are. And that's one of the more insidious and problematic aspects of the entire informant system.
Yes, good point. Marwa, since we had that example about, what's in the FBI file and it may or may not be true, do you want to talk about how the FBI can lie to you, but you can't lie to the FBI, and how they handle these interviews? Do they record them? What do they do?
So, of course, we know the technology is readily available for them to record every single interview they conduct now. They don't record them in the vast majority of cases. What they'll do is they'll take notes and they'll issue a 302 after the interview.
Report.
Obviously, it's them taking the notes. They're not necessarily writing every single word you say down verbatim. It's a summary, in essence, of what that conversation was with you. And that's why you don't want that summary created to begin with. And that's why we discourage these meetings. So no, there's no recording of it. And it is a summary written down by the agent when they approach you. And also, like these community outreach meetings, there's summaries written down of the information they obtain from there. A lot of people believe what they're saying is innocuous, like it won't have any kind of long-term effect. And they're like, oh, we just, have these general conversations, but all of the stuff is noted down. Oh, I noticed Mohammed wasn't attending the mosque as much as he used to. That's noted down. And then somebody else says, oh, I saw Mohammed doing this. Like that's noted down, and like it's tied in, and it might create an image, like Trevor was saying, of something negative, even though like there's actually in essence nothing there, right? So that's why we discourage these meetings with the FBI.
Yeah, in addition to that, the FBI can lie to you and say they have evidence they do not have, and trying to, that's what police always do, right? But with the FBI, if you even slightly lied to them, not even lied to them, but maybe they interviewed you 3 times, and once you said you forgot something, and then you might have remembered it later and told them, they can charge you, and they have charge you with a crime of making a false statement, and you can go to prison for that. And you can even get the terrorism enhancement and go to prison for quite a long time for that, even though normally it wouldn't be a long time. So it's really dangerous in a lot of ways to talk to them. All right, I want to mention about these databases. Trevor, you mentioned your database, and it's been really helpful to us to be able to see that database since it was available online. And we have our own database too, which has tons of cases also, and we are going to be making that available when we launch our new website. Well, after we launch our new website. So it's great to have these databases as a resource. We actually studied our database with help from Trevor's and others out there, and created a report last year called Inventing Terrorists, where we analyzed about 600 cases that the FBI called terrorism cases, convictions, and we discovered that the vast majority of them were what we call preemptive prosecution. and 74% were what we call purely preemptive prosecution, where there wasn't really any real crime going on. Maybe small scale things like the false statements, things that wouldn't really be crimes. Like if you lie to somebody, that's not usually a crime, but it is under the federal law. Or small scale immigration things like leaving out something on an immigration form, things like that that are really minor. But the FBI either got the person in a sting operation or managed to charge them with material support to terrorism in some way, or some kind of weird conspiracy, or sometimes a combination of all of those things. And another 24% of the cases had elements of preemptive prosecution where they weren't really terrorism cases until the FBI turned them into terrorism cases. So the vast majority of cases where the FBI says they caught terrorists and they convicted them were manufactured cases in some way. And our report's available. If you Google inventing terrorists, you can find it and download it on the internet. And now I'd like to try to get to some of these questions before we wrap up, and then we're going to wrap up. And it's been great to talk to all of you. Let's see what we got here. So Shahed Hussain says, Marwa mentioned declassified FBI documents from a decade ago. Are these publicly available somewhere, or can you get them through FOIA? You want to respond to that, Marwa, about declassified FBI documents?
I'm operating off of memory here, but I remember the community outreach program being cited as one of the things, and I actually saw it in specific cases that I worked on, where it would be included as part of the discovery material, where it would be a record of like a community outreach meeting, and then like that would be part of the discovery used against defendants. And I do recall reading an article, this is like years ago, regarding the use of community outreach, specifically within the Muslim community, not just for the purposes of so-called building that relationship, but for the purposes of gathering information.
And I'm not an expert on FOIA. I don't do it a lot, but I know you can FOIA stuff if it's something that's publicly available. If it's something that's through a particular person, you might need permission from that person. I don't know if you know anything about that, Trevor, about getting documents through FOIA, like declassified FBI documents.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, I'm pretty sure the documents that came out in the community outreach use for surveillance were out of California. I can't remember the exact method through which they came out, whether it was FOIA or some litigation. As far as like FOIA is a pretty broken system, but for that reason, it's probably still worth using. And so the one thing to say is like, you can request documents from the FBI. They're often very difficult to obtain, but kind of more importantly, you can request your own file, which is often worth doing. And you can also then, using this form called a certificate of identity, you can deputize or authorize someone to get your file for you. So for example, when I work on researching cases, that's often a tool that I will use. So, as far as like, it may be interesting for some people, especially if they think they have been subjected to surveillance or investigation to some degree, to, request your file. The other thing I was going to note is at a project at the Intercept we published 2 years ago, we obtained policy documents related to, these were classified documents that were leaked to us that related to the so-called DIOG, which is the Domestic Investigations Operations Guideline, which is the policy manual that the FBI uses, as well as the informant handling guidelines. And we wrote stories that kind of documented what the FBI's policies are, and that in many ways the policies are different from, how they pretend to act. An example would be, as Marwa was describing, often immigration is used as leverage, and they'll say, we'll help you out, we'll help you out. But one of the things we found was that in the FBI policy, that if someone is, being kind of put at risk, or if immigration authorities want to collect that person for removal, that the FBI is duty bound to help immigration find that person, find the informant that they had all this time been claiming they were, going to help, right? So anyway, so if you're looking at how the nitty gritty of how the FBI policy works, I would recommend that. It's the guidelines are now a couple of years old, but they should pretty much, I would imagine they're pretty in line with how the FBI is currently operating.
Well, that's very helpful. Farouk, asked, how can he get a copy of your Terror Factory? Well, it says Terror Factory film. Terror Factory is a book, right?
Yeah. So it looks like Mel put the YouTube link. Yeah, the film is available online. It's free to watch, and the book you can get it at any bookseller, including Amazon.
Okay. So there was a question here, and we're going to wrap up pretty soon. But there was a question here about the EGO Act. Will the EGO Act address the FBI's use of paid informants? So yes and no. So the EGO Act, I can answer that. That's a bill that I actually drafted, and I don't know if it's ever going to go anywhere, but we have people working on trying to get a sponsor for it in Congress. And it does three things, and I'll just talk about one of them now because we were looking at, what do we do about all these cases where we have hundreds of people who are unfairly convicted and sentenced to these long sentences in these cases, and what can we do about it because the law is so terrible. And so I thought, well, one of the things is there's not really an entrapment defense anymore, because if you get targeted by an informant and they're manipulating you, and they're promising you all sorts of things. Sometimes they promise you lots of money and all sorts of things, and that should be entrapment. But the way the entrapment defense works legally now is if you don't back out of it, if you don't back out of it, that's called a ready response to this stuff that they're offering you. Then you can be convicted, even if it's basically entrapment. So what I wrote in the EGO bill about that was that they should not be able to target somebody for prosecution if that person wasn't already taking substantial steps toward committing this crime. Like because they go after tons of people who never would have done anything if they weren't manipulated and coaxed and offered all sorts of things by the FBI informant. So our EGO bill would affect it by saying you can't build a case against them unless you can show that they were already doing this, taking substantial steps. Because in the drug cases where they use informants, it's basically where they know that somebody's selling drugs. They have evidence, but not quite enough evidence to charge them. But they have lots of people, telling them this person's selling drugs. They can even set up surveillance and show it, but they need to actually have somebody buy drugs from them on tape in order to really have a strong case. So, but they know they're selling drugs. So that's what they do with those cases. And sometimes they have abuses there too, certainly, but most of the time it's people who are selling drugs. But with these terrorism cases, it's not people who are even gonna do any acts of terrorism. They're just afraid that someday maybe they might in the future because they said something like, upsetting what's being done to Muslims. I wish somebody would do something about it, or something, all sorts of things, And so then they target them and they dangle these money in front of them, or they tell them that this is required from their religion. I know Trevor was talking about, I think he left. Is he still on here? Oh yeah, he is still. Hi. I know he was talking about how over the years they have gotten kind of better at doing these plots. It's like a case in a box. It's like they know what works. They know, they got away with it in these early cases, but there's been a lot of pushback about that, showing that these people didn't commit any crimes, even though they got convicted, and they're still in prison in many cases. But they did get better at it. But I also noticed that part of what they did is they targeted very vulnerable people more and more. I see a lot of people that are mentally ill. They went after single individuals a lot of times who were very alienated, mentally ill, or vulnerable in some way to this. And they would go after them and manipulate them. And then if you complain about it and you say, how can you do that to this person? This person is just sick. They need help. They'll say, oh, but what if it was a real recruiter that got to them? But it's not right. I don't know. Do you want to respond to that, Trevor, at all? And then we'll wrap
you're
up.
absolutely right. I mean, we are seeing increasingly more and more vulnerable people, including people who have diagnosed mental illness and others whose mental illness is quite likely, but just have not had that diagnosis. And I have asked FBI agents about this, specifically, and the response I always get is like, we are not a social services organization, right? Like we are an organization that finds criminals, and our only kind of recourse to get people off the streets is to arrest them. And that tends to be kind of the FBI's true believer response in that way. And so in many ways, the other thing that's worth noting is you're absolutely right in that the FBI's defense of these tactics is to say, we are getting off the street today a person who, an Al-Qaeda or ISIS agent may kind of weaponize into the future, right? And like that is possible, like anything is possible in this world, right? But the thing to remember is it's never happened, right? There's never been a situation where some kind of like otherwise hapless person who has, aspirations of violence meets this ISIS recruiter and gets a bomb, right? And so, so the situation that the FBI is basically saying they are prevented is theoretical to this point. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind when that tends to be the FBI's response or defense for why they use these tactics on, hundreds and hundreds of very vulnerable people.
Yeah, and just as far as their response that they're not a social service agency, well, guess what? When there was a young white Muslim convert who did actually she wasn't given a bomb or anything, but she got in touch on the internet with an actual ISIS fighter or communicator or something, and he got her to convert to Islam and was trying to get her to go to Syria and be a wife or whatever. And the FBI found out about it. They reached out to her, and they didn't charge her. She didn't get charged. She backed away, and she was in touch. They could have easily charged her. They could have easily, without it being even a sting operation, but they didn't because she's a white woman. So that tells you a lot right there. I would like to thank all of you for being with us. We're running out of time. I wanted to give Herrera, if you're still with us, Herrera, a chance to say anything to wrap up, since you haven't gotten a chance to say anything in a while, and then we'll just wrap up.
No, just thank you for having me. I didn't prep much because I got told last minute, but thank you for having me. It's just my experiences that I was able to share. You guys obviously offer a lot more, and I've done a lot more. And when I was younger, I was a lot more helpless, and we definitely appreciate, the effort that you guys put into it. And there's a lot more families that are kind of going through it right now. And I'm really glad. I'm ecstatic that my dad's home and Salah's dad's home back in Kurdistan. So, like the suffering for being in jail and being away from the families kind of, it's kind of done, but now it's like a new suffering that's still going on, where they're like, why was I away for so long? And they're thinking about it, and they're kind of mortified. But thank you guys for having me. I appreciate it. And hopefully, we've raised some awareness today through speaking about it, at least.
All right, thank you. It's great to have you. We'll have to have you on again. And it's been amazing to watch all you kids grow up, you and your brothers and sisters, and Yassine's kids too. It's been so close to my heart to see all of you grow up and become such wonderful, amazing people despite everything. And thank you to both of you. We'll have to have you again. We could talk forever about this stuff. There's so much here to talk about. Thank you so much. All right, goodbye.